Hello everyone and welcome back to the NPC Dungeon. Today we're talking about splitting the party, a dreaded phrase that people say no DM wants to hear, and yeah, it isn't always an easy thing to deal with, but I have 4 tips that will hopefully help you plan for and adopt this wrench that can all too often get thrown into the works. But first, I want to make a quick announcement. I recently started adding more animations to my short videos, and by more I mean literally any, and I'm only adding more in the future, so they're just a little bit livelier, so be sure to keep an eye out for that. But that's it for that, so let's get started and let's learn something. The first point about splitting the party that I'm going to talk about is really the most obvious, and it's find a way to bring them back together. After all, they will be back together eventually. The moment they split, you need to have this in the back of your mind. Now, sometimes it's completely obvious. Maybe they're in a dungeon and they split up to deal with 2 separate pathways. Well, after dealing with each separately, maybe the 2 paths can converge and they meet back up. And this can happen even if you don't have the 2 paths converging already. Sometimes as DMs, we have to change these things. That's the meaning of adapting, but that's just an obvious example. Another one would be if they, for example, have to look for something and decide to try out different locations. This is another relatively easy one because in this case they probably plan to group back up in the future anyway. But what if they go off in entirely different directions? This probably won't happen too terribly often, so I won't spend too much time on it, but it's still worth mentioning because it does still definitely happen. And you definitely still want to be ready for when it does. The first thing that I do is I let my players converse and discuss it. Often they'll talk themselves out of it, but when they don't, I don't stand in their way or throw up a wall, unless of course one would naturally be there anyway, like if they're going to a shop that is either closed or in the process of being burnt down or something like that. But all oddly specific examples out of the way, what I usually do instead is I let them, or at least I let them start. What I mean is I try to find something in the backstories or goals or whatever that would tie them together. Maybe a few players decide to go and work for a shopkeeper because they really want to work for that shopkeeper for some reason, but the rest want to go on a quest to the mountains. Easy. Maybe the shopkeeper won't let them until they complete a quest for them, or does let them but sends them on their first quest to the mountains to get the supplies for him. You can even have the shopkeep be a wise figure who talks to them about the values of friendship and sticking together. Hint, hint. The shopkeeper might even return later and be an important figure in the story in some way. That example might be a bit contrived, but I think it gets the flavor across pretty nicely. This is why it is important to know what motivates your PCs and what is in their backstories. It's useful to have a few notes set aside for this and to plan ahead whenever you think your party might split. But what if you can't? What if you don't predict it? Well, that happens. That's my next point. A lot of the same principles that I mentioned in my last point still apply here. Pull from backstory, find similar things that motivate the players and ways to pull them back together. So this point won't be too long. It's mainly about how to give yourself time to plan on the spot when you don't have very much to build off of, because that's the main issue here. Sometimes you just need more time, and that's fine. Putting the party provides some pretty unique hurdles that I'll mention in my next couple of points, but it also provides a great opportunity to give yourself, well, time. Since your players are all separate, you don't have to address them all at once. What I like to do is I like to swap between which player or players that I'm talking to based on who I have the most ideas for. I'll handle the easier ones first and be thinking about the kinds of things that I want to happen to the others in the back of my mind while I'm narrating for the one that I'm dealing with. For an example from my own work, the 3rd campaign that I told stories from on this channel ended in a bit of an epilogue where one of my players went off guilt-ridden and confused, but with the all-consuming goal of becoming the apex hunter of the world they were in. Another returned to her home, and the last 2 stayed behind to save the world. I frequently swapped between them as needed in order to deal with all the curveballs my players threw at me during the session, and there were many. As a quick note, I'll go ahead and leave a link to that video and to the playlist that whole campaign is on, just so you can watch it if you like, and I highly recommend it. It ended up being probably one of my favorite campaigns that I ever ran. But let's move on to the next point. I mentioned earlier that splitting the party presents some very unique difficulties, and I'll talk about one next, namely difficulty. The main problem that a lot of people have with splitting the party is scaling back the difficulty that you set when you had a couple of encounters planned for a full party that is now only faced with half. But this isn't so hard. Keep in mind, your players didn't know what kind of encounter that you had planned for them, so you can change this and alter things to suit the new encounter and the new amount of party members as you see fit. It could be as simple as decreasing the amount of enemies or scaling a monster down. If simply debuffing a monster isn't possible for whatever reason, you can always find an in-world reason why the monster might be weaker. Maybe there's an even stronger monster down the road that attacked the monster that your players come across, and it has to fight them injured. In fact, your players might not even try to fight it now. They might try to calm it down, figure out what happened, and help it. And if you know the details of the monster that attacked it, or how it went down, this shouldn't be too hard to improv. And going back to what I said earlier, if your players don't have a reason to regroup already, a powerful monster lurking down the cave might provide them with one. And even then, that's just the tip of the iceberg. You can really get creative with this too. Maybe the encounter becomes a stealth encounter where you give your players an alternate route around the monster, maybe an overhanging path high above one of the cave walls they can can take if they are quiet enough, and if not, the monster wakes up and chases them down the cave, so they now have another opportunity to escape. And if all else fails, you can always introduce some kind of ex machina, like larger monsters coming down to eat the monster your players are trying to outrun. But be careful not to overuse that last bit, given we take the stakes away if you're not careful. And either way, I really hope that last example helps you out and gives you inspiration, as this process can really be applied to much more than just combat. And if this does happen and your players do split up, you definitely should try to scale things back or make things easier in some way, shape, or form, because the last thing you want to do is punish them for splitting up. After all, you're not trying to kill the PCs, at least I hope not. And if you notice, all the encounters that I gave, at least to me, were still interesting, and that's super important to keep in mind whenever your players decide to split the party. It's also my next and final point. What if your players split the party when you only have one encounter planned? You need to find a way to make the journey that the other half of the party takes interesting in some way. It can be as simple as having an NPC show up or a monster fight. It doesn't have to be anything too fancy. This is why it's helpful to have a few encounters just kind of stocked up and ready in the case of events like these. But if you don't for whatever reason, or you just can't get them to fit with the setting or the narrative you're telling, look back at what's going on in the world. If some of your players end up wandering into a cave and you know that a city of Duergar awaits below, think of what the dwarves are doing and how this could lead to the encounters that you could plan or make for your players. And if you need to, handle the other half of the party first to give yourself time to think of what you want to do when the other one takes the spotlight, just like I said earlier. I actually told a story kind of like this a little while back. I'll leave a link in a card below, and I'll also leave a link in a card to videos on combat, player randomness, and planning for encounters, where I go over this method in a little bit more detail. But that's it. I hope you enjoyed it and hope you found it useful. Feel free to check out this week's story, where I return to Screech, a character that I played a little while back, and come back next week where I'll talk about social encounters, and return to my current campaign where I talk about a fun little combat encounter that I put my players through. I want to thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And of course, until next time, let's learn something.